Hi and welcome to the fourth video in the series, but the third one where we are looking specifically at the topic of variables and how we use variables in our Python code. Just a suggestion, guys, if you are revising or if you are new to variables, just go through the prior videos, the videos prior to this one, to make sure that you've covered off the scope of variables to date and that you haven't missed anything. So the purpose of this specific video is for you to become familiar with the term global variable, for you to be able to round float data to a given decimal place, and for you to be able to change data from one data type to another using casting, or to give it its correct name, typecasting. Just a reminder, guys, as always, the Python Monster resources, the videos and the booklets are available to you and they're to supplement your learning in the classroom. You may also find those useful for revision as well. So, the scope of variables. The term global variable means that you can use or you have access to the value of a variable from anywhere in your Python code. Now at this stage, I just want you to be aware of the fact that actually there's also the concept of the local variable. The local variable is only accessible from some parts of your code. So far we've only been using global variables, and that will be the case for the time being through the next few videos until we get to you guys writing your own functions, and then I will introduce you to the local variable. But I did want to mention that there are two variables at this moment in time because we're talking about variables in general. It's the topic of variables. Let's talk about casting. If you watched the last video, the big question arising from that video was, if the only type of data that comes from the keyboard is the string data type, how do we convert string data type to number data type so that we can do some maths? And the answer to that question is, of course, casting. Casting is the term that we use for changing any data type to another data type, and in fact Python does its own version of casting behind the scenes as well, called internal casting. So you may remember in the previous video I showed you how Python allows you to use a float and an integer data type, or float and integer data types together in the same expression. Python goes away and it converts the integer data type in that expression to a float data type, and it does it for you, which is something that other programming languages don't do. So Python is very, very helpful and flexible in doing its own internal conversion so that you don't have to do that. The other thing we're going to have a look at, especially when we do some coding in a minute, is the ability to be able to round a decimal number to a given number of decimal places, which is something, of course, that you do in maths as well. So this is another example of a Python function. Here, guys, you can see the command word, which is round, okay, followed, of course, by the opening and closing bracket. So in this case, we do need to put a couple of things in the brackets. We obviously need to tell Python what the decimal number is that we want to perform the rounding on. So in this case it's 12.4454, and then with a comma after that we need to tell Python how many decimal places we want to work with. So in this example it's 2 decimal places. So if we round 12.4454 to do 2 decimal places, Python rounds up and gives us 12.45, okay, just like you do in maths. Here's a slightly longer example. We've got a bigger number here, 12.4454976. We're asking Python to round to 4 decimal places. So to round to 4 decimal places, and of course that gives us 12.4455. So again, guys, it's rounded up. Okay, if it sees the opportunity to do that, just like you guys do in maths, it will round up to 12.4455. Okay, so all of those things I'm going to bring together in some Python examples, which I'm going to do now on the screen. Okay, so let's start off where we left off in the previous video, where we were trying to do some maths with string input from the keyboard. Okay, so we're going to need a couple of variables. So I'm going to say num1, or even num1 equals input. Okay, so our input function, let's put in the instructions, please input a number, and then I'm going to do my famous double arrows and a space, and then I'm going to copy this line of code, because the next line of code is going to be very similar, except for a different variable name and a slightly tweaked instruction. Input, please input another number. Okay, let's attempt to print out the product of these two numbers, so num1 multiplied by num2. So you know what I'm going to say next, guys. If you watch previous videos, of course, Python evaluates, or at least attempts to evaluate, the expression in the brackets, the mathematical expression. Okay, so the product of num1 times num2. So let's run that, put some numbers in. Please input a number. So let's put in 12, and let's put in 10.5. Okay, and there we go. We get the expected Python error, because, as you know, we are trying to do maths with a string data type, and in fact Python does its best to give us a meaningful error message. It says can't multiply sequence by non-int of type string. So type in Python, guys, it's very common for Python documentation, and indeed for interpreters like we've got here, to use the shortened version of data type and just say type. Okay, so if you see type, it means data type. So can't multiply sequence by non-integer of data type string, which is Python's way of saying, sorry, can't do maths with strings, which we sort of knew anyway. Okay, but from a selfish perspective, it means that I can keep the same code on the screen. So let's get rid of the box, guys. Okay, so obviously we need to do some casting. So there are a number of different options that you have in terms of where in your code you decide to use the casting function, which we're going to do now. So I'm going to show you one method, and then I'm going to keep the code more or less the same and show you the other methods as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that special feature of Python where not only can we reuse an existing variable and put different stuff in the box, okay, using that analogy of putting values in box, but something which other programming languages won't allow you to do, which is to reassign a value of a different data type, which Python will allow us to do. So I'm going to use and abuse Python's flexibility, and I'm going to say num1, okay, becomes the result of, so I'm going to use the float, this is the float, oops, okay, this is the float function, guys. Okay, this is the function for converting one data type to a float data type. So clearly we want to put in the value that we want to convert, which is sitting already assigned to num1. So I'm going to put num1 in there. Okay, so Python, as usual, goes away and it starts on the right hand side. It gets num1, okay, or the value of num1. It says, oh, okay, that's the string data type of, say, 12. Okay, and then it goes up a level and it goes, okay, now I've done that, I need to convert, okay, the string version of the number that's already assigned to num1, and I need to convert it into a float data type. And when I've done that, I put it back in the variable that I got it from originally, which is, of course, num1. Okay, so it puts it back, or reassigns it to the variable called num1. And we're going to, of course, do something similar with num2 as well. So num1 becomes the result of converting the existing contents of num1, or the existing assignment of num1, to a float equivalent or a float data type. So let's copy that code and do exactly the same thing for num2. I'm just going to put a comment in, okay, just to be consistent, and just to set an example to you guys of commenting your code. So I'm going to put cast to float data types, okay, and then I just want to convert this to num2, sorry, retype to num2. Okay, it's the same again, get the existing value that's been assigned to num2, convert it to the float equivalent, the float data type, and then put it back or reassign it to the variable num2. So if I run this now, let's put in the same numbers. I think we put in 12 and was it 10.5, I think? There we go, 126. Can't remember exactly what we did in the last video, guys, but you get the gist. So 126, so Python worked for us, okay? And of course, because we asked Python to convert to a float data type, it gives us a float data type answer of 126.0. Okay, now whilst I'm on the subject, guys, whilst I'm on the subject, I'm going to show you a really useful trick to remember when you are working with numbers but you've got to do casting. Let me just show you what happens if I convert this to integer. So in other words, I'm asking Python to cast to the integer or the int data type rather than float. Okay, so let's run the code, and this time I'm going to behave and I'm going to put in some integers, so 12 and 10. Easy peasy. Okay, 12 times 10 is 120. Okay, now let me run the code again, and this time I'm going to be cheeky and I'm going to try and put in the string equivalent of a float data type or a decimal, which is 12.5. okay, and let's just to bring it home, let's put in another string equivalent of a float data type, okay, or a decimal. So let's run that, and you can see it gives me an error. And what it actually says here, let me just zoom out a little bit. What it actually says here is invalid literal for int. Okay, ignore the base 10. What it's basically saying is you've asked me to convert to an integer, but the string equivalent of the numbers I've got are actually floats. Okay, so that's not going to work. So let me show you what happens then if I go back to the float cast, or casting to a float, so as it was before. Okay, let's run the code again. Let's get rid of that box. Okay, so please input a number. Okay, so I'm going to start off with integers. I'm going to put in 12 and then 10. I get 120. Okay, cool. So I've used my input. I've put in the string equivalent of integers, 12 and 10. Okay, whole numbers without a decimal point. So let me run the code again. And this time I'm going to put in floats. 12.5 multiplied by, sorry, getting a bit ahead of myself there. Second number 10.5, and it gives me 131.25. Okay, so the point that I'm making, guys, is actually if you are using the float data type, or you're casting to a float, you can accept the string equivalent of either integers or floats. That doesn't work the other way around. Okay, so if you are converting or casting to an integer, then Python will not accept the string equivalent of a float. Okay, it comes up with an error. So floats are by far the most flexible way of working with numbers when you've got to do casting. And if you're really desperate to have integer values, you can convert from the floats into integers later on in your code. All right, but if you're getting user input and you use the float casting function, you're likely to have less errors than if you use the integer, and it gives the user the flexibility to either give you the string equivalent of integers or the string equivalent of floats, and Python will accept either as long as you are converting or casting to the float data type. Okay, so I said a little bit earlier on that there are different places, if you like, or different options where you can do casting in your code. So if you look at this and you're thinking maybe, actually, if we are going to simply ask Python to take the existing value of a variable, convert it to a number data type and put it back, wouldn't it be really cool if we got Python to do all of that in advance and just do the assignment once? Guess what, guys? You know what I'm going to say. Let's get rid of the box. I'm going to get rid of these two lines of code because I don't need them, and indeed my comment. So I'm going to put up here cast into variables, okay, from input. So what we're going to do now, instead of assigning or converting and reassigning a casted data type back to the original, I'm actually going to do it on the fly. So I'm going to wrap around the input with float, okay, and then I'm just going to put brackets at either end. All right, exactly the same here. I'm going to put a float, okay, with brackets at the beginning and end. So what I'm asking Python to do is to take the user input, okay, and then immediately cast it from the string, okay, into the float equivalent. So it basically means I've lost 2 lines of code that I don't need, plus the comments, and Python does all of this before it actually assigns anything to the variable. It's done all of the work for you. All right, so let's just move that up. Oops. Let's just run this to make sure it works. So let's input some numbers. So let's start off with, so again guys, because I'm using floats, I'm going to start off by inputting the integer, or the string equivalent of an integer, 12. Okay, and for my second number I'm going to put the string equivalent of a float. Okay, and there you go, I get 162.72 in just 3 lines of code, which is fantastic. All because Python will do the conversion on the fly. As soon as it's got the input from the user via the keyboard, it will take the input as a string, cast it to whatever data type you want here, and then put or assign that value straight into the variable. Okay, so that's a really, really nice way of doing it. One other option you've got, okay, is to cast when you need it. So I'm going to take this out. All right, we're going to go back to the original input, so the raw string input. Okay. So you know guys, we've got now string input. So if I put print num1 multiplied by num2, okay, just to show you again, okay, 12 10.5 gives us an error guys because we haven't done any casting, so it's trying to work with the original string input. What I can do is I can cast to the float data type when I need to at the print statement part of my code. So I'm going to put in here, I'm going to wrap these two around with brackets, and I'm going to ask Python, okay, to give me, so I'm not going to do that guys, I'm going to do float, okay, of num1, okay, and then I'm going to do float of num2. Okay, so I'm asking Python to convert num1 to a float before it multiplies, and then convert num2 to a float before it multiplies, then evaluate the expression as number data type. So let's run that and make sure it works. Let's put some values in. Input a number 12, input a number 10.5, and there we get 106. So you can see the flexibility of Python. You can choose an appropriate point in your code to do your casting. You can either cast on the fly directly at the point where you get user input as a string. You can assign the float or whatever number data type you want to a variable, or you can do your casting at the point where you want to print, for example, to print your numbers out onto the screen. Okay, so via the objectives of this video, I also said that we would cover rounding a float or a decimal number, a float data type, to a certain number of decimal places. So let's do that now. So let's get rid of our existing code. I'm going to change my comments. Okay, an example of rounding a float data type. Okay, and let's just make that a little bit more legible. So let's hard code in some values. Let's put num1 equals 12.3456, num2 equals 10.57. I'm going to create another variable called total, which will be the product of these two. So num1 multiplied by num2. And let's print total and see what a huge number of decimal places we get, guys. Okay, that should be a lower case. Okay, so let's print and see what we get. Okay, well, it's not too bad actually. 130.369536. So that one we can work with. I can show you how we can convert that, or round it, I should say, to round it to 4 decimal places and to 2 decimal places. So what I can do is I can reassign to my existing variable, which you saw earlier. So total becomes the existing value of total rounded, let's put total in there, to 2 decimal places. Okay, so let's run that and see what we get. Okay, so now we get 130.37. So Python will always take the opportunity to round up, okay, if that's appropriate to do so. Let's change that to 4 decimal places and run. Okay, so we get 130.3695. So you can see when I did 2 decimal places, All right, because we got the 9 there, it rounded it up from 0.36 to 0.37. Okay, what happens, guys, if I change this to 0 decimal places? What do you think we're going to get? Are we going to get a float, or are we going to get the integer equivalent? Let's run it and see. So 0, okay, it does actually give us the equivalent of an integer, 130, but because we are working with floats, Python expresses it as a float. So you'll get the 0.0, the 130.0. The reason I mention that, guys, is because there is always some confusion and a misconception that if you use 0 in the rounding function, Python converts to an integer. But in actual fact, you can see there that we do actually have a whole number expressed as a decimal, 0.0. What could I do, guys, on the basis of what you've seen so far in this video? What could I do to turn that into 130 as a whole number? Well, okay, no prizes really. I just take the existing value of total, okay, and then I do int, which is the casting function to convert to an integer data type, and then I'm asking Python to use the existing value assigned to total and then to convert it to an int. So let's just run that and see what we get. Now we get a whole number without the decimal point being expressed in the answer, guys. Okay. Okay, so before we finish, I want to give you an example of how we can do casting and go from a number data type back to a string. So I'm going to use this example on the screen at the moment because, as you know, as you can see, total, okay, because we've converted it to an integer, total is an integer data type. So if I put in here, for example, let's put in the result is space plus. Is this going to work, guys? Let's try it and see what happens. Well, no, indeed. And actually, it's an example of where Python does give us a slightly more helpful error message than it normally does. It says, can only concatenate strings. Indeed, because we can't concatenate any other data type apart from string data types. Okay. So what I could do, let's just get rid of the box and move this over. If I'm desperate to concatenate, what I could do is I can just put in the string casting function, which is string open bracket close bracket, which is what I'm going to do there. So I'm asking Python to take the number data type that exists and has been assigned to total, okay, and then use the string equivalent, okay, or convert it to a string data type version of the total. So let's run that and see what we get this time. And we do indeed get a concatenated string. So the result is 130 because I've asked Python here to convert from a number data type, which is the integer, into a string data type. Okay, so we can do the conversion back from number data type to string data type. Okay, guys, that's all of the Python demos that I wanted to do for this video. I will see you in the next video.